God, I invite you into this place. I know you're already here. Come into our hearts too, God, and come into my heart and come into my voice and help me to say the things that you have to say. I've spent some time thinking about this stuff and tried to come up with some things that can be helpful. But Lord, you're the one who needs to show up, and you need to help us to understand what's happening in your word so that we can live our lives in a transformed way that glorifies you. In the name of Jesus Christ, we pray these things. Amen. Okay, so we are actually at the end of Matthew. I know that sounds shocking, but was it somebody said on Friday that ever since they've been at UCC, they've been in Matthew? Most people. Okay, so does UCC do anything else but cover Matthew? Well, up till now, for the last while, no. But we do cover other things, and they are at the end. We're on the last chapter, and this is, in fact, the penultimate teaching, because next week we talk about the thing that comes next, the last section. I'm not quite to the end, but this is the resurrection, and this is probably the happiest, joyfulest, most exciting part of the whole story. We've been marching in this direction for a long time. For the last two chapters, we did 26 and 27, starting with Jesus declaring, I'm going to be crucified, and then the Pharisees plotting the crucifixion and setting, and then the alabaster jar that caused Judas to just flip out and say, I gotta go turn this guy in. The lighting of the fuse happened at the beginning of 26, and all of 26 and 27, if you were here on Friday, as John asked if those who were here, some of you weren't, we read, a big part of that service was just the reading of those verses, talking about Jesus as he is at the end of his ministry and then going into Jerusalem and then being tried and then being tortured and then being executed and then being buried and then the guards set up to protect the tomb. We marched through all that on Friday. And now here we are, Sunday morning, perfect timing, because that's where our story picks up, is on a Sunday morning, and it's not by coincidence that we're on this sermon today. It's because we worked it out that way just perfectly. I think it's Vicky who worked that out. Thank you, Vicky. So when the last thing that happened was that Jesus died and was buried. And the meaning behind that is all, the timing is super important. It's kind of funny how the Jews went through all this effort to be like, okay, hurry, get this over with so that it won't interrupt the Passover. Funny, because it was the fulfillment of the Passover. Jesus was executed at the very time that the Passover lamb was being slaughtered. And the whole meaning behind the Passover lamb goes way back to Exodus. And I don't want to go into too many details, but the Passover is kind of important in this story because the lamb was executed so that the blood could be smeared on the door so that the angel of death would pass over the houses that had the blood on the door. That was the first part of it. The second part of it was, as soon as the angel of death passed over, it killed the firstborn of every family that didn't have the blood on the door. Then the Hebrews were free to leave Egypt. So they packed up their things, and that's why the Passover has unleavened bread and all. It's all to represent the fact that you don't have time for the bread to rise. You just have to bake it and be on your way. That's the whole concept behind all. That's why we eat crackers that are flat. Like, it all ties together to that historical moment when Passover is the death of the lamb and the fleeing from Egypt. So that's the context under which Jesus is killed and buried. And that's where we leave off. And it's super important that part of the story happens because of what happens in this passage here. So we start off with the women. I'm gonna read this part again. After the Sabbath, so after the Sabbath was the last day of the week, which means the first day of the week, i.e. Sunday. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he is risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, yet afraid, yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly, Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." And then we go into the rest of the part there. That's the part I want to talk about first. Who were these women, and where did they come from? The answer is actually found in the previous chapter in verses 55 and 56. So Matthew chapter 27, 55 and 56. Many women were there watching from a distance. So this is when Jesus was killed, and then they took his body and they buried it. And when they buried it, many women were there watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee to care for his needs. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. So Zebedee, of course, sons of Zebedee are James and John. So James and John's mother's there. Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, is there. Mary Magdalene is there. But it says there are many women. There's a whole slew of women over here that are figuring out where they're putting Jesus and where he's being buried. So Jesus gets buried, and they're paying attention. Where are the disciples? They all ran away. Well, not all of them. John was there at the cross, we know, because Jesus talked to John and Mary, and there's an exchange there. But most of the disciples are beside themselves and have run off. So I would like to point out to you who didn't run off. It's the women. They stuck by him. They cared. They were looking after his needs. A lot of the people that were surrounding Jesus were kind of concerned about themselves. The women were not. They were concerned about Jesus, clear to the very, very end. Someone pointed out to me that if you're going to write a story in a paternalistic culture that's going to convince people of the truth of your claims, you don't write it about the women. Because paternalistic cultures think that men are the only things going on. They're the only important things happening. Most of the Bible is written by, about, and for men. There is one major exception, and that is the Gospels. The Gospels, if you read the Gospels, you will notice that the Gospels are filled with the activities of women doing this and women doing that, and blessing and being good, and all, wonderful things that are happening in the Bible, in the Gospels, but they're not nearly as prominent in the rest of the Bible. I think it has something to do with the fact that Jesus has a lot more respect for women than the people of his day. He lived in a society that was filled with men, and they were paternalistic, and men kind of, it was important. They were what was going on, because it was kind of the needs of the day was that somebody had to take care of the kids, somebody had to do the laundry, somebody had to cook the food, and it took a lot of time, and they just said, well, that's your job. We're going to let you do that. And they didn't have a recognition of the value that these people held. And I think that's a frustrating aspect of cultures around the world. Sometimes it's true in our culture today. I think that it's less true in our culture today than it has been historically, but I think we still have a ways to go. I think that it is no coincidence that the people who watched where Jesus was buried were the women. I don't think it's any coincidence that they were the ones to show up after the Passover to care for the body. So here they are on the day. Like, they don't know that there's going to be a resurrection. They're there to put spices and wrap things, and, because they couldn't do it during the Passover. That was the whole thing. That was why the Jews were all in this big rush to get it all over with, because they didn't want to miss out on the big meal, not realizing that that was the whole point of the whole entire thing. So there they are, first thing in the morning, bright and early. It's no coincidence that they were there to take care of the body. It is no coincidence that they got to be the first people to say, oh, wow, you're back. So, looking at this passage just a little bit, it's kind of exciting. Like, really, there's this, the women show up, the women come in, and they're here to take a look, and there's this massive earthquake that takes place. It must be an aftershock from what happened the Friday before, right? Or the Thursday before, when it was that he died. Because they said that there was an earthquake then, and a whole bunch of people came, dead people came out of the graves, and the whole, weird stuff was going on. Earthquake so bad that it split the veil in two. All kinds of stuff happened several days earlier. Well, here's another earthquake happening. This one's kind of a smaller scale. The only thing that happens is the stone got rolled out of the way. And the angel, whatever role he had to play in the earthquake, came and sat down on the stone. There's some irony there, eh? The guy is super bright, and he's super, he's kind of shocking to the women. And I don't know, every single time you ever hear a story about an angel, like sometimes we see pictures of angels, and they're all kind of cutesy and fluffy, and they have the little harps and whatever else. Well, those do not strike fear in me, I'll tell you that. But every single time an angel shows up in the Bible, people end up on the ground, and the first thing the angel always says, not always, but almost always, is, stop being afraid, it's okay. Well, little cutesy angels don't say, stop being afraid. They say, stop laughing. Angels in the Bible are big, fearsome, scary creatures that put out so much light you can't really see them straight. It's kind of like trying to stare at the sun. So this guy shows up. He's got a serious dose of power. He has so much power and so much light and so much awesomeness with this earthquake and the rest of it that all the guards, now we're going to talk about the guards later. The guards end up on the ground. They either passed out or they were so scared they wanted to be passed out. I don't know which. But they're on the ground and they're out cold, and then the angel has a conversation with them, and he says, I know what you're looking for. You're looking for Jesus. Jesus was crucified, but he's not here because he is risen. Can I get a hallelujah? He's risen. Like who, where, how does that happen? The funny thing is, the story doesn't actually tell us. It doesn't tell us what happened. It just says the stone was rolled away and he wasn't alive. He wasn't dead anymore. He was alive. So then he says, go and tell the disciples to go to Galilee, and off they go, and they're simultaneously frightened out of their wits and very excited. You ever been like that? It happened to me one time when I was on a hunting trip with my brother, and I saw a bear. It scared the snot out of me. And he's the one with the gun, and he wasn't that far away, and I ran, like those things move really fast through the woods. But anyway, I got to him, having seen this huge bear running through the woods, and all I could do was laugh. And it wasn't funny. But there was this giddiness inside of me that was kind of like, I just saw a bear. I really think that they were experiencing that at that moment, an emotion that was just overwhelming. Wait a sec. That thing that just scared the snot out of me also said weird words like, he's risen. And there's this excitement inside of them, and this enthusiasm, and they're not walking back, they're running. And as they run, who do they come across? They come across their friend. And it's not just any friend. It's the friend that they've followed for the last 3 years and put their hopes on him, and they have taken care of his needs, and they have met his needs, and they have cooked for him, and they have cared for him, and they have loved him, and they have shown him their diligence and their service. And it all fell apart, but even after it all fell apart, they were going to take care of his dead body. They love him so much. And here he is, alive. And you can only imagine the emotion going through their bodies as they experience this moment, and the chunk, chunk, chunk of the gears in their head as they go, huh? Absolutely amazing moment. And Jesus, like every alien we know, says, greetings, earthling. Not the earthling part, but he really does say greetings according to the NIV. And what do? They run up to him and they grab him and they hold him. And he says, same thing the angel said, don't be afraid. It's all good. It's all good. And at this point they're going, at a level I don't understand, I believe you. Because for the first time in their life, they know, without a doubt, that it's all good. Everything's okay. And they don't have to be afraid anymore. Like, what can you do to somebody who's seen a risen Lord? Who's seen their friend that they love and trusted and thought was somehow special and then got slaughtered in a gruesome, horrible way, is now back? Like, it's going to blow your brain. And I'm convinced these women's brains were exploding. Emojis everywhere. Okay, so that's the women. It's funny how our author posts the contrast. So now we're going to talk about the guards and the Pharisees. This whole section started with the Pharisees, the beginning of chapter 26. The Pharisees plotting to execute him. This whole section. That's when the fuse was lit. So I call the sermon the explosion. I like to have goofy names for stuff. So the fuse got lit way back at the beginning of 26, and that fuse has been burning this whole time, slow burn all the way through, and then it just kind of went and died. It's almost like it hit the bomb and went out. And for 3 days, nothing happened but sadness and mourning and horror. And then, bam, it exploded in the form of an earthquake and a stone being rolled away and Jesus being gone and an angel saying, he's risen. And then the women running into Jesus. So it's this emotion, this power, and the joy that we experience as we read Matthew and go, oh, wow. But the book ends. There are the Pharisees at the beginning plotting to kill Jesus. And here are the Pharisees at the end plotting yet again. I'm going to read the passage again. Actually, I'm going to go back a little bit. If you go back to the end of chapter 27, so this is how we ended on Friday. Matthew 27, verses 62 to 66. The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. Sir, they said, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first. Take a guard, Pilate answered. Take a guard, Pilate answered. Go and make the tomb as secure as you know how. So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. And now we pick up with today's passage, 28, verse 11 to 15. While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, you are to say his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. It's remarkable that the Pharisees simply refuse. They simply refuse to see what is right in front of them. They refuse to acknowledge the work that God is doing, even when it is awesome and amazing. The guards probably came and told them a true story. They probably didn't say we were asleep because they know that I don't know. There's a tradition that believes that if you have a prisoner and the prisoner escapes, it's your life for his. And so guards took their jobs very seriously. This isn't exactly a prisoner situation, it's a dead body, but their job is to do this one act, the one thing they got to do. There's only one thing they have to accomplish, and that's to make sure the body stays in the grave. And they failed. So in failing, you can imagine the fear going through their heads. Like, this is a different kind of fear than the fear the women were experiencing. Of course, they probably felt that too because they saw the angel, and they either passed out of fear or were so frightened that they pretended like they were passed out. They just laid groveling on the ground because they were scared to death. And then once they got up and they went into the city, they're still scared to death because now they failed because the body's not there anymore. And that was their job, keep the body in the hole. Didn't happen. So now they go and they talk to the priests, and the priests say, it's all right, we got you, it's fine. Just tell everybody that we fell asleep and that somebody came and stole the body while we were sleeping. And if it gets back to the governor, because it would get back to the governor, we'll cover for you and you're good. And they gave them not a little bit of money, they gave them a large sum of money. They bribed them. They bribed them to say, hey, we didn't see anything, we know nothing, we slept through the whole shebang. At some point, and you know what, I say to myself, at some point the Pharisees had to clue in. But really, there were Pharisees that were cluing in. We know about Nicodemus. We know of Joseph of Arimathea, I think, was one of the Pharisees. He was a wealthy guy. He was one of the establishment that did clue in eventually. Some of them did clue in. And maybe even this experience caused others to clue in. I don't know. But there are enough of them that are so busy rejecting truth when it stares them in the face that they won't accept it. They will not accept truth no matter how clear it becomes. There are people like that. And that's unfortunate. And God bless them. Hopefully they come around eventually. But I just say, that's a dangerous place to be. At some point, that which is clear, you need to land on what's obvious. And these Pharisees are refusing to take that step. And what they've done is, the original part is they took a seal. So the seal, basically the way they did a seal was they would like melt wax, pour the wax on it, and then put a signet in it so it can't be redone. So you can't like move the stone out of the way, get the body out, put the stone back, and then pretend like it's still there and nothing happened, because the seal's broken. Everybody will know that something happened. So that, they can't just, that was the whole concept behind the seal. And also the stones, they were kind of made, it was a big deal. It was like permanent. It's a place to bury a body. It's supposed to stay there. And so the stone, it usually took several people, and in one of the other Gospels talk about the women where they finally get to the stone, they get to the grave, and they're like, oh, wait a minute, we forgot about the stone. What are we going to do? There's nothing we can do about it, because we can't move that stone. But that wasn't required because the earthquake took care of the job for them. Okay, so the thing I want to say about that passage is that Matthew spends a lot of real estate on a story about the guards. It makes me wonder, why does so much effort and energy get put into he spends a lot of time on the Pharisees in general, but these specific stories about the guards, he's got a paragraph in the previous chapter and a big paragraph in this chapter, and the Bible, Matthew's book's not all that long. You can read it in one sitting. And to have this much emphasis on the role that the guards play, you've got to figure he's got something he's trying to say to us. And I think the reason is because he knew that there was doubt that Jesus rose from the dead, and he wanted to address that doubt and show that it is an unfounded thing. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit. We don't have the same circumstances. We are reading a book that was written thousands of years ago, and we have to either trust that it's true or assume that it's not true. Like, how do we know? How do we know that somebody didn't make this up? How do we know all these things? There's an historian that I recently attended a conference. Some of you guys know about that Dig and Delve conference that happened recently. And the purpose of this conference is to talk about the likelihood from a historical perspective of whether or not the resurrection took place. And I find that thing kind of interesting. It's a little dry, and I'm going to kind of go real fast here because it is a touch dry. But I want to go through it because I think it's important. There are the different types of people, and some of us are a little more emotional, and some of us are a little more intellectual. And so those of you who are not interested in the dry aspects of boring theology, just kind of tune out for a minute or two, and you'll be good because I'll go real fast. There are 6 points that I want to make. John and I are in a competition. He's winning. He's on 14 points. I have 2 different sets of 6, though. Does that count? This is my first set of 6 points. Why the Gospels are believable. And it's according to a gentleman named Mike Licona. He was the guy who came and spoke at the conference. So I've got 6 points that I want to put up here. Oh, we even have pretty pictures to go with them. Nice. All right. The first reason that that we can believe that the Gospels are believable, according to Mike Licona, is number 1, the author intended to write an accurate account. It fits the biographical genre of the day, and it is the stated historical intent of the writer to write an accurate account. So that's one reason. Number 2, the author chose sources judiciously. In the case of now, that's true of all the Gospels, but specifically Matthew, he used Mark, a document called Q, and at least one other source, if not written by Matthew himself. Number 3, the author was responsible with his sources. So all the authors were responsible with their sources. Compared with historians of the day, in fact, they did a more accurate job reflecting what other people had written, such as Plutarch and Josephus. Josephus and Plutarch were sometimes loosey-goosey with Scripture and with quotings that they did. But the people that wrote the Gospels were quite accurate. If you notice, there's a lot of overlap between Matthew and Mark, and that's because Matthew was written using Mark, and the parts that he used, parts of it he just took verbatim, word for word, and then the other parts he corrected, maybe a grammatical correction or a bit of a clarification, or sometimes taking out some of the more dramatic pieces because Matthew didn't seem to be as dramatic a person as Mark was. Number 4, the author was capable of accurate retelling. The story was written, everybody generally agrees that the Gospels were written within the lifetime of the happenings that took place. And I give the example of the History Channel. If you go and you watch a documentary by somebody who's talking about something that happened in World War II, of course maybe some of us aren't old enough to have seen those documentaries, but Vietnam War or something else. You can ask people questions about stuff, and they put them on the History Channel as a source that's worth listening to, even though that happened 40, 30, 50 years ago, decades previously. People remember things that are of intense meaning. And I think that even though the Gospels were written decades after the resurrection took place, I think that they're still capable of accurate retelling, and that was his argument. As is true with people who experience battles that get interviewed on the History Channel. Number 5, we can verify many of the events. Names of the times are used throughout the Bible. If you want to try, if this is an invented story, somebody did research at a scale unprecedented before to come up with a way to do this, because the characters have names that just fit. People like, Simon was a real common name, and others. Then they name real people who are actual historical figures that fit. They talk about real places, and trying to make up a story like that with real places and real people that kind of fit, that match the historical context is really, really, really hard. And so if you think that the Gospels were an invented story, well, these are reasons why it isn't. Number 6, only a small percentage of reported items have a reasonable chance of being errors. And I give the example of the difference between the two Gospels, between several of the Gospels that say the death of Judas. In one case, he fell and died, and the other one, he was hanged and died. And as Josh said, it could be that actually both took place. That kind of thing is not impossible to have. It's not that one happens and not the other, but it could be that somebody got it wrong, and we don't know. But from a historical perspective, it's possible that the fact is that there are a few number of verifiable errors between them and historically. And for example, another example is that the census is not mentioned in any other historical account, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen just because it wasn't mentioned. And even if they got that part wrong, the general gist of all the Gospels is in the general right direction, and the Gospels generally get along with each other. That's the point. So all 6 points, I'll roar through them again real quick. The author intended to write an accurate account. The author chose his sources judiciously. The author was responsible with his sources. The author was capable of an accurate retelling. We can verify many of the events, and only a small percentage of reported items have a reasonable chance of being errors. So those are the kind of an academic look at why the gospel is a reliable source to discuss the resurrection. Now, I say that, and then I say, but you don't even have to use the gospel to come to the conclusion that Jesus came to resurrection, and that was part of Mike Lycona's presentation also was, this is why the Gospels are reliable, but I have an even more reliable source, and that's the writings of Paul. And then he goes on to describe how Paul tells about the resurrection, because Paul wrote sooner, more close, and he was a hostile witness, and he's got a bunch of reasons. I'm not going into that. Sorry, I already did. If you want to know more about this stuff, because if this is the part of the story that's interesting to you, like how can I know that Jesus really was resurrected? There's a site called risenjesus.com, and that's this fellow Mike Lycona I'm telling you about that I saw at the conference. It was a couple weeks ago. risenjesus.com. And if you want to look into it, he's got some videos on there. He's got some writings on there, publications, free materials. Like the guy's an academic who wants people to know the truth. And from a historical perspective, his conclusion was, I don't remember if it was one of the questions, but I thought it was really neat. He said, it's historically about as likely that Jesus rose from the dead as that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Nobody even wonders whether or not that happened. And yet everybody all the time are questioning, well, Jesus didn't rise from the dead. How can that be? Nobody rises from the dead. No, they don't, unless there's a God, and unless that God sends his son to earth, and that Son comes to earth to set us free, well, then suddenly a resurrection becomes a possibility. So, what I want to finish off with here is the importance of the resurrection. And I've gone a touch long, so I need to speed up, and it's a little speed up when it's a little dense. It's maybe there's just so much. It's a resurrection story. I'm just excited. Let me talk briefly. This is my second list of 6 items. I have 6 items that tell why the resurrection is important. Why does it matter? Number 1, it proved that Jesus was not a false prophet. He claimed he was going to rise from the dead, and then he did. He is not a false prophet. Number 2, it was the fulfillment of the second part of the Passover. So the Passover was kind of 2 parts. There's the lamb being executed and the blood mopped on the door and the angel passing over, and then there's the getting yourself together, taking your unleavened bread, and rushing out the door out of Egypt and fleeing to the promised land. This is the second part of that. It's the fleeing Egypt into the promised land part of the Passover story, fulfilled right before your eyes in the form of a resurrection as he flees death. Number 3. Okay, so I want to briefly. Theologians have kind of come up with 3 broad topics for, it's a very important question, why did Jesus die? And I sort of feel like that's a conversation that Jesus had with God in the Garden of Gethsemane, because he's there and he's like, God, if there's any way, let's not do this. Why does it have to be so awful? Why do I have to die? Why? And the Bible doesn't tell us. But a lot of theologians have sat around, they've had thousands of years to do it, and they've come up with some pretty clever ideas, and they fall into 3 main buckets, and 4 if you want to split one of the buckets into 2 parts. And I don't want to go into too many details, but there is the bucket that talks about a ransom and how Jesus comes as a ransom for us, and that one kind of goes closely with the Christus Victor, and that's that Jesus is the victor over Satan and evil. The second bucket is a guy named Anselm who wrote and said that the atonement theory, the reason Jesus died is because we are evil because of the sin that has come into our lives because of what happened with Adam, and God is holy, and so we're separated from God, and so we have to receive the punishment of our sin, and so we can't be in right relationship with God, and so then the punishment comes to us, but then Jesus gets in the way and takes our punishment for us, so we don't have to take the punishment, and then we're declared holy, and then we're in right relationship with God. Okay, so that's kind of the second theory of atonement. And then the third one is that it's sort of an example. Jesus' life is an example. Jesus loving people and living out goodness to the very end in a form of, all the way to death, is an example to us. And that was by a guy named Abelard. These guys wrote about 1,000 years ago, a little less, I think. And so then his example then becomes for us the reason for why the story took place. I'm not sure, but that all 3 of them have a little piece of it, but I don't know for sure because the Bible doesn't come out and tell us, and so they're just theories, but they're theological theories that make a bit of sense. So what I want to say about that is that the Christus Victor one, it's one of the main 3 atonement theories. It's closely associated with the ransom theory of the atonement spelled out cleverly by C.S. Lewis in his book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is the first book of the Chronicles of Narnia. And if you've never read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I highly recommend it. It's supposed to be a children's story, but it's a children's story in kind of a sneaky way because it's a really complicated story in simple words. And if you'll think about that book in the context of Jesus coming and dying for us, it will blow your brain because C.S. Lewis is a brilliant writer and he has a very clever way of presenting it. Christus Victor is often considered the classical view of Christian atonement, most clearly laid out in 1930 by Gustav Olin from Sweden. He says, its central theme is the idea of the atonement as a divine conflict and victory. Christ, Christus Victor, fights against and triumphs over the evil powers of the world, the tyrants under which mankind is in bondage and suffering, and in him God reconciles the world to himself. I'll point out to you that if you've seen Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, it kind of features a satanic feature that thinks he's triumphed over Jesus at Jesus' death. It's kind of a creepy scene, actually. Although I have to say, it's a really neat poetic moment where the camera's looking down on the crucifixion scene, and then you kind of backs off, and it's this sad, the Satan's rejoicing, and there's this wailing sound in the background, and then it all goes blurry, and then the blurriness drops away in the form of a raindrop, almost like God's looking down and begins to cry, and then it just pours. Of course, I didn't see that the first time I saw the movie because I was too busy crying myself. But it's a really powerful poetic event that happens in the movie. I think that's pretty cool. Sorry. Number 4. Okay, so that's number 3. That's the Christus Victor. For the Christus Victor to be successful, it's this war with Satan. And Satan thinks he's defeated Jesus, but in fact, Jesus defeats Satan by rising from the dead. And that's how we have victory over sin and death. And that's the importance of the Christus Victor. That's another reason why the resurrection is important. Number 4, it is the proof that Jesus' death meant something. Proof that he was the atonement for all time. And this applies to both Anselm's theory and Abelard's theory. So anybody can die. In fact, all of us here are going to, unless Jesus comes and we get carried away before that all happens. Dying is not a big deal. So when Jesus says, I'm going to die, everybody looks at him and goes, well, of course you're going to die. All of us are. His death was special, though, and he claimed it was special by saying, first, I'm going to rise, but also it means something. And you can't just die and then it means something. It's like something has to say that death was special. So God showed up and said, okay, well, just to make sure that you know this death was special, I'm going to raise him from the dead. And so here we are on Sunday morning celebrating Jesus having risen from the dead, understanding because of it that what happened last week when he died, metaphorically, happened last week when he died, helps us to realize that had meaning. It got between us and sin, our punishment. Our punishment was taken on by Jesus. That's powerful. Jesus is an example because everybody dies. Which example do you follow? Well, follow the example of the guy that gets resurrected. You're sure to not go wrong then. So I say it's proof that Jesus' death meant something. Number 4. Number 5, it means that we serve a living God. Jesus is alive. That's pretty neat. And finally, number 6, it is a prototype for our future resurrection. That's just a fancy way to say it means that we have hope that we too can experience resurrection someday. Because Jesus claimed that we would be resurrected. And if he claimed he would be resurrected and he was resurrected and he claimed that we would be resurrected, it means that resurrection is true and that we have hope for resurrection for ourselves too. Resurrection into eternal life. All right, so those are my 6 reasons for why the resurrection is important. Number 1, it proved that Jesus was not a false prophet. Number 2, it was the fulfillment of the second part of the Passover. Number 3, Christus Victor. Number 4, it was the proof that Jesus' death meant something, whether it be because we were made in right relationship with God through his death, through the atonement, or because he was a good example. Number 4, proof that his death meant something. Number 5, it means that we serve a living God. Jesus is alive, unlike Buddha or Muhammad or anybody else. And number 6, it's the hope that we have for a future resurrection ourselves.